Hello, and welcome to another episode of No Notes, where the conversation is always a perfect 10. This podcast is powered by Elios Health, the most used and most loved AI platform in behavioral health, equipping more than 100 organizations and over 10,000 providers with powerful automation tools that streamline documentation, simplify compliance, and surface deep care insights that drive better client outcomes. I'm your host, Dr. Denny Morrison, and for today's episode, we are excited to be joined by Dr. Alison Cerezo, Senior Vice President of Research and Health Equity at Empathic AI. We'll chat about the current state of bias and ethics in AI and what behavioral health professionals can do to help ensure these tools are used to support rather than detract from equitable behavioral health care. Welcome, Alison, and thank you so much for being here today.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, first, before we get into the questions per se, I'd like to hear a little bit about you and what's your background and, what do you do at Empathic? And I hear you have a new puppy and...
Yeah. So I live in Long Beach, California, with my wonderful wife, Maria. And I am a tenured professor at UC Santa Barbara. But I am on special research leave, and I am Senior Vice President of Research and Health Equity at Empathic. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I've been in academia if we're including grad school, we're going into 20 years. But I was a professor for a long time. I started first at a clinician training program, a clinical psychology program. And then from there, I moved to the Cal States, and I used to run a master's program and also work for the chancellor's office, understanding how data, really informs the ways that we need to better support students and really thinking about education as public health. And then I moved to UC Santa Barbara because it's a research institution. And so I ran my own research lab there. So I've been a researcher for a very long time. But I also very much always had a deep love and desire to work on cultural issues. And so as somebody that is, Latina and whose parents, immigrated to the U.S., I also grew up in a mixed documented family. All of those things have really, really fueled my desire to look and use science in a way that really is about creating a better world. And so I have such a passion for science and research and also methodologies. So it's not surprising to me that I ended up in the space of machine learning and AI.
Hey, you're a kindred spirit. I got my cognate, my doctorate was in research methods. So you're really passionate about health equity, aren't you? Why is that important?
For me, I think my primary identity is being a good clinical scientist. Right? That's what I care a great deal about. But when it comes to health equity, it's really rooted, right? I have such clear, vivid memories of being at General Hospital in Los Angeles, right? Being there with my aunt who really struggled with her kidney at times and waiting for hours for her to get care. Right. And so this is me, right? As a 5-year-old, up until I was about 12 when she finally got surgery. Spending maybe 1 weekend a month in General Hospital, right in the waiting room. And I was born in the US, but my aunt wasn't. And so I feel like I had such a deep personal understanding of how this health system doesn't necessarily, I wouldn't say it doesn't work, but it's just not accessible to everybody in the same way. So having that background and then seeing other loved ones really struggle with being able to get the kinds of care that they need. And so, that's always been, right, the motivator that I had to become a clinical psychologist, to become a researcher. And before I went to grad school, I also used to do community organizing. So I have a strong sense of, how to get things across the board. Right? And so for myself, I'm very focused on systems change. And so when I think about that, right, there's certain principles like universal design, right? It's this really wonderful theory. That we understand that if we build tools or we build systems with a focus on the people that are the most vulnerable, then you have built a tool or system that benefits almost everyone, right? So that we don't build something with this theoretical average of what somebody needs, but instead we build it, to really cater to people that are the most vulnerable because then we all benefit from it. So that has always been right at the root of how I think about approaching science. And so for me, when I think about good clinical science, it's health equity. Because you can't build tools that only support maybe 30% of the population and then expect wide scale adoption, right? And so I care a lot about access, and I care a lot about making sure that people, have tools that are like feasible and acceptable to them. And so for that reason, right, because I care about doing good science, then health equity has to be embedded in the way that we do it.
And so how does that translate to your work at Empathic? And first, tell us what Empathic is before you did. Explain to the audience a little bit what Empathic is about.
Sure. So we're a conversation intelligence company. So we're really focused on the life sciences and healthcare. And so the way that I describe it, right, to lay folks is that we're often in the background, right, of a patient visit, of maybe, a clinical trial, like maybe a dosing session or something of that sort. We're also in the background of maybe how you administer an assessment, right? So we provide coaching, right, to really support you. And the term that we use is like just in time, right? And so that you get feedback that is immediate, and that can really help to make clear, right? Like what are the skills that you need to learn? What are some of the things that you did really well? But also, what are some of the tips of how to communicate, how to deliver clinical care in a way that is best for patients? And so in my role as SVP, right, of Research and Health Equity, a lot of my job is really focused on understanding, like, how do we get the most robust training data possible, right? And how do we build tools that are robust in step one, right? And so I care a great deal about that. And so that means, right, that the data that we use is diverse, that it is clinically validated, and that we do our best to really build in a way that is responsive to the diversity in the world.
And so, we know that there are a lot of people, most people who are listening to this have heard the horror stories about bias in AI. And I think I'm sure that plays heavily in your mind in terms of your day-to-day work, in terms of how do you control for bias, I guess, as much as you can. Why is that? Should that be concerning to behavioral health professionals?
Yeah, I think it's the same way that like we engage as humans, right? So as a professor, right, at times students have asked me like, well, what about microaggressions, right? They're like, I never engage in microaggressions, right? And I like to tell people that when we think about bias, it's not a yes or no, it's a continuum. It's a continuum of like infrequent to frequent, right? And so if we don't have the kinds of training data that help to guide the way that we might build, right, a new tool of sorts, then we're building it for certain groups of people, or we're building it based on this theoretical norm that isn't actually a norm for most people. And so that's why bias really matters, right? Your ability to understand that it is going to be present and that you build systems and mechanisms to mitigate it. But I think what I hear a lot of clinicians talk about is like their worries about AI, right? And like really focused on the bias aspect. And that's something super important that we all should consider. But what I would also, make clear is that bias is in a lot of our practices, right? So even our DSM has a lot of bias, right? So the most basic way that we think about mental health disorder and whether folks are going to actually qualify as having depression or PTSD or something different. But bias is everywhere. It's not about whether or not it's there. It's about understanding that it's there, and then doing your best to mitigate it as much as possible.
So how should providers try to mitigate that when they're using AI tools? What can they do to be sure that the tools that they're using, they can either recognize the bias or be sure that the bias has been minimized? What should a provider do relative to these AI tools that are really popping out in the market these days?
Yeah, I think for myself, there are a few things that I do. First and foremost, right, I look at who's developing the tool. I want to understand whether there are any clinicians involved. And a step above that, whether they're licensed clinicians. I think for myself, that matters because I'm a licensed psychologist, right? And I have a clear understanding of the kinds of federal, or not federal, right, but our national and our state level ethics, the ways that we had to demonstrate that in tests, but then in addition to that, our continuing education, right? And so the reason I say it is because it's deeply embedded in us to really consider patient safety always, right? To do good and do no harm. Like those are the first two as aspirational, right? Key themes that we think about in ethics for psychologists. And so similarly, if you have clinicians involved in the development of tools, then they are led by those values, and that matters a lot. But I think there are other things that are important too, right? It's not just who is part of the team, but it's also, terms that we use in some AI model development around transparency and explainability. But those terms are really similar across the way that we do clinical science in general, right? But I think for a long time, AI was not necessarily being built by clinicians, or clinicians really saw it as something that wasn't necessarily germane to the work that they do. And so I think that we have kind of this like artificial like schism between like clinicians and like AI developers. But I'll say that I love working at a company where several of us are clinical researchers, right? And so that we approach tools, tool development, not just with like, is this going to work for what the customer needs, but also, are we doing good in the world, right? Are we building things that are going to help patients keep them safe, but also help them get the kinds of services that they need and help clinicians to perform better?
Yeah. I wrote an article some time back, I think it's on the Elios website, on the similarities of developing large language models and doing research projects or norming a psychometric instrument. That there's some very similar commonalities across, and you've even taken it even further than I did in that my little article. But I like that idea. I think because one would hope we'd use the same values as professionals when we do any of these things, and that mitigation of bias and transparency. I think those are all important values that sometimes we do see, sometimes we don't. I mean, this. There's 10 to 20,000 apps out there for mental health care, and only 3 to 4% of them have some research foundation that's even been documented. So it's the exception, at least in the client-facing tools. It's the exception rather than the rule right now in terms of all the standards that you just described. But bias is a risk. I mean, there's in a psychometric instrument, there are no 1.0 validity and reliabilities.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say that.
And
right, like when you begin to understand, right, even the process of how you develop a psychometric instrument, right? Say, I was working with a student, right, who's creating a new survey on social media use and how it actually supports or is really challenging for youth, right? Because we know that youth are online and the ways that they engage with social media is really complicated. But with that, like there's so many decision-making processes that happen once you get the data. So it's not as though the data tells you something that's yes, no, but then you start looking at your eigenvalues, right? You start looking at how different items come together and how they associate and whether it makes sense to have 2 or 3 sub-themes, right, as part of an instrument. And so that's when I go back and I think like, okay, on this new, tool that somebody has created, this company, is there a clinician in the room? Does a clinician have some decision-making power? Because I know that they got trained in certain ways to think about how to work with data, but I also know that they're really driven by all the complex and nuanced ways that we think about ethics, right? And so years ago, I used to teach ethics. And I remember I would tell folks that it's not as like things are yes, no. It's that we have to decide what the speed of traffic is when we enter a road and we don't see a sign that tells us. And the best way to determine your speed of, the speed of traffic is to talk to other clinicians, right? And so it's like to look at the cars next to us, and we should be within pace of them. And so similarly, as we're thinking about building new tools, it's like you do have to have clinicians in the room. In the same way that we would practice ethics outside of like technology, but just practice in general with clients, right? If somebody is presenting with something that's really complicated, we talk to other clinicians, we do peer supervision, and we figure out what is the speed of traffic. What would most people do in this situation? So using those kinds of principles, we should use them in tech too.
Yep. I like that. That statistics prof I mentioned to you earlier, he had a favorite saying, life is a probability statement. Like there is no guarantees, there's always the likelihood that something's going to happen. So how do we use AI to kind of improve clinical quality at scale for kind of in the big picture? And this is, I would expect you to be a little bit speculative here if you want.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that I feel really proud of, right, and we talk about at Empathic is that we have found that our AI models are 700 times, right? So 7 times more effective at detecting clinical risk than human providers. And part of what so this is my assumption, right? I think that this has to do with a few things. I used to be, right, I developed a clinic at UC Santa Barbara, and I used to supervise like 6 doctoral students. Each of them had about like 5 clients. It was wild, right, in terms of the scale. And I couldn't review everything. It was humanly impossible, right? But what I would find too is that the ways that we would say what is clinical risk looked really different based on like how senior the student was, how much they really understood what imminent risk looked like, right? Like if they could catch the right phrases, the right tonal features, effect, right? All of that. And so when you have an AI tool that can do 100% quality oversight, then you have the ability to catch more of that. But also you have a tool that isn't really worried about hierarchy, isn't necessarily worried if the clinician is a man, right? Like is just paying attention to what is said and how it is said. And so in that way, when I think about the power of AI to do some of this quality oversight and coaching of clinicians, I think it's incredible the amount of potential there, right? I know for myself, like one of the things that I get very excited about is the ability to see more AI used within like crisis hotlines. I'm not sure if you know, this came out last week, but there was an AP report that showed that LGBT youth in particular had a 700% increase in crisis line usage right after the election results. And so what I think, right, in a dream world is your ability to coach folks to help them detect like, hey, actually that might actually be more suicidal risk than you think it is, right? But also on the back end, being able to have the data to understand how youth are talking about their mental health, right? So I think that's what's really incredible for me when I think about NLP is like, it's not just what was said, yes, no, but it's also how it was said, right? Like, I don't know personally of like data that helps to track like how exactly trans or non-binary youth might talk about suicide differently than other youth, right? When you have computing power that we haven't had before, right? So in very recent past, then you have the ability to really track how people are saying things, what they're saying, and then coach them immediately, right? To deliver more precise and more empathetic care. I also really believe in innovation and I believe in different kinds of people innovating. And I think, right, like a tool that I would create for LGBT youth would look very, very different than if an LGBT youth created that tool themselves, right? And so that's where I think that there's so much potential and incredible, just opportunities that we really haven't faced before. And I'm excited to see what comes out in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I was going to say that the two of those areas is the idea of using these tools for supervision so that you can do 100% review. And I think the other part is the decision support part. When you think about these tools that are clinician facing, like Elios's products, they're built, they're essentially decision support tools. And it's kind of like having a co-therapist in the room. Did you notice that the client said this kind of thing? And again, it's always giving clinicians information to help them make a better decision, not to make a decision for a clinician. But the way we can do that now is so different than even the stuff that probably you and I both had in grad school, where maybe you're hearing things after the fact. Your supervisor listens to a tape or something, and a week later you get feedback about it. And it's like, I need something a little quicker than that. I don't want to change my behavior.
Yeah, I would say, right, like, so some of the work that we do, right, is like in the background of like patient and provider visits, right? And I will say, like, doctors, they have so many patients that they see in a day, right? And so if you're a provider and you make a particular comment that might be dismissive, right, or you don't get enough symptom information or whatnot, you go through the course of your day, and then maybe in the afternoon and the evening, you're writing your notes, right? So like what you said is not necessarily going to come to mind, right? There are particular things that might be salient to you as a provider, but the way that you write your notes are not necessarily going to reflect exactly what was said. And so, but your patient remembers, right? Your patient has such a clear memory of what was said. There's this one study by Hook that was in 2016 that I always come back to. They sampled over 2,000 patients, psychotherapy patients that were all people of color, and 81% said that they had at least one microaggression in therapy that they faced. And that microaggression was tied to attrition, right? So them dropping out of therapy. And so when I think about those numbers, it makes me think, right, like our tool, how exciting it is, right, that like you can log into the platform as a clinician, see the entire transcript, see all the detections, and if there's a moment of minimization, you click on the transcript and it'll show it to you in the video feed, right? So it's like a coaching tool. It's incredible for you as a supervisor, but it's also really incredible for you as a clinician in training, or just a clinician in general, right? To understand like, oh, wow, when I said it, it might have landed this way. Like, let me circle back with the patient. And so I think that there's something really incredible there with that 100% quality oversight that I've never had as a clinician myself, right? And so I think about how much stronger and better I would have been as a clinician if I'd had that sooner.
Yeah. So what do you come from a strong academic training background. Do you see much of these kind of tools being used in academia yet in terms of psychologist training services? I know that's not the focus of today's talk, really, but I'm interested. I like to digress a bit. So do you see this being used much in academia?
I think there's more openness to it, right? I think that I think there's still a long way to go. But I will say, right, my colleague Dr. Jolly and I, we presented at APA, and we were talking about AI for social good. And we thought maybe 15, 20 people, but it was like 75, 80 came to our talk. I was floored by the very different kinds of responses people had in the room. Some clinicians being very worried about it and being very upset, and other clinicians being like, well, this is a game changer. Like, I can't even imagine this, right?
Right.
And so I think that, I think when it comes to note taking, that seems like one that people are much more open to, right? Yes. But I will say, like, some of the other ones, I think are going to take a little bit more time for uptake. But I think as we have, clinicians, like even this podcast, right? Like, hopefully it would open clinicians to understand, like, oh, wow, there are some quality oversight tools here. I'll say for myself, right? When I developed the clinic at UC Santa Barbara, it was a racial trauma clinic. And so we were specifically trying to figure out ways to actually assess for how people were experiencing trauma related to racial identity or racial experience in the world. And this was like specifically right after there was really huge news about killings, right, that were happening to folks, Black individuals in particular. And so I remember being like, there's only so much I can do in like reviewing your tapes or hearing you talk about something that happened a week ago versus the ability to actually see, like, did you ask the question? Like, how did you ask about the trauma? How did you respond when somebody said X, Y, Z? And so I know for myself, like, that is an incredible tool, an opportunity that I don't know that we've really had before, apart from like sitting live in a room, right? The next room over through a mirror.
Or the two-way mirror thing, yeah.
And so I do think that people are starting to see, like, or just be more attracted to the idea of like note-taking. And then I think when we start talking about quality oversight, right? And we start talking about having a human in the loop and 100% oversight, I think that those are things that are attractive to clinicians. But I think it's still hard for folks sometimes to understand exactly like which tool, right? Because as you mentioned, there's so many tools out there, and it's hard for folks to know which ones have been validated, which ones, right, are being done with clinicians in the loop. All of that is kind of hard to tease apart. But I will say, right, that I first, got in contact with the CEO of Empathic through Therapists in Tech. And so it's really lovely online Slack community. At first, when I joined, there were only a couple hundred people, and now they're like over 3,000. But I think that every day there's like an intro channel and people are talking about, hey, I want to learn more about being in this space, right? And then the other thing that I'll say is that I am starting to see too through NIH, there's a program called Aim Ahead. And there's a new call that went out that I sent out to several of my friends. And I was like, look at this. This is incredible. Like NIH will support clinicians to learn more about how to embed AI in their work. And there's even one call that's like for nonprofits and AI developers to work together to develop tools. And so I do think that there's going to be more innovation that's not necessarily coming out of tech, but more so coming out of these community like rooted ways of like being able to better serve their folks. And so I'm super excited to see what comes down the pipeline from that.
Yeah, I know I'm working with Elios on a ARPA H grant right now. Another, not kind of your typical SAMHSA grant type source, but they're wanting to do something, kind of a big swing in terms of how to move the needle on healthcare, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah,
that's interesting to know about the NIH grant. That's available. So what else do you see that's out there that's kind of opportunistic for clinicians to kind of improve time or improve clinical quality? What else is out there you think is going to be impactful for our industry?
I think a couple of things. I think that moving to the space of like care pathways, right? So making sure that when people, especially if they've been an inpatient, we know that there's there's oftentimes a very large drop in folks not necessarily getting to therapeutic care. So I think that would be a beautiful way that AI can provide support and maybe connect people to folks who are actually available. That's a big one. I think also I see it with like coaching, right? Like the ability to support coaches who are more accessible oftentimes. There's one called peers.net that I think is really beautiful. And it's like youth that are certified coaches that like support other youth. Right. And it's an online platform that people could communicate with each other. And so that I think is really beautiful as well as an opportunity where AI can come in, like I had described with the crisis centers, right? And being able to like provide some sort of like co-pilot, right? Or like co-therapist support to make sure that people, that youth are able to, provide care that is aligned with like best practices. And so I think that like the care pathways, and then, just really focusing on making sure that people who maybe are not PhD level or licensed, but who are providing all of the support, right? That they have the ability to get the kinds of feedback and tips and all the stuff to make it land in a way that's really impactful.
As a former CEO of a mental health center, I can tell you my greatest worries were those folks, those bachelor's level folks who are made up 70% of my clinical work staff, who were the least trained, but they were they were literally out in the field on their own and providing, some guardrails for them and some helps to them to help them kind of make their jobs easier, but also make sure that they're not working outside the scope of their practice, even though they weren't professionally trained, but that was always a big worry for me. So we're about out of time. I want to get your kind of final perspectives here. What advice would you offer providers, practitioners who are thinking about using AI? What should they be keeping an eye out for as they look into AI in their practices?
Sure. So I do think that there's some pretty nice policy, right, that came out from the White House most recently. There's also APA has the mental health advisory or mental health tech advisory group, right? So they're putting out blog posts on a regular basis. I also would highly recommend Therapists in Tech as a community and resource for people to learn more about different ways that technology is working out in the field of mental health. I know that there are other, like policy groups like Meadows as one, right, that are trying to put out guidelines and give, policy support to folks. But I think in addition to that, I would really look up the website of the tool and I would try to figure out, is there a clinician involved, right? Do they align with like AI principles around ethics? I would also check to see that if the tool you want to use is HIPAA compliant, right? Like there are some checks and balances, right? There will be more in the years to come, but there are some now. And so I think the HIPAA compliance, making sure that a clinician is involved, and then looking for some of the policy guidelines that are coming out from different groups that are really in the know, and they're very current, right? Like these are things that are coming out every couple of months. So I would do my best to stay abreast of that kind of information too.
Yeah, there, as you said, there's a lot coming out and a lot that will come out, and this is not a flash in the pan. This is going to be the way we do business going forward. So it's probably good to get on top of this. Well, with that, I want to wrap us up. Alison, thank you so much for this. This has been really helpful, and I hope our audience has gotten something that they can use from this. I think they did. You got lots of good references, tangible things they can do to take back to work and implement and start thinking more seriously about the issues of equity and risk and what the future is for AI. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.